Hello everyone, welcome back to the Agatha KEKL Snap channel. How you doing? So today I want to do something interesting for you guys. I have a simple to complex tier list. This is really something that a viewer asked me, and as I thought about it, I was like, oh, this is actually a really good video idea where we're going to be ranking all of the common deck types right now in regards to how simple they are to play, pick up, regards to how complex or complicated it is to pilot. Because there are some decks that are just a lot easier to play. You just play a few cards or so. So that's kind of the idea of this video. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get into it. So I do have some criteria that I made for myself to kind of rate how I view a deck, right? So these are some of the criteria I have. Obviously, this is pretty subjective. And if you play a deck, it's gonna feel easier to you. So there might be some decks I put a little bit harder to play than you're like, oh no, I played this a lot and it's very easy for me. Well, that's obviously because you've played it a lot, and I'm just kind of looking for like general. If you started and you didn't really know the game, how easy can I, teach someone how to play this particular deck? So how easy is it to explain? How many cards are you playing per turn? Obviously, if you're playing more cards, there's more thought processes. You have to figure out where to put every single card. It's a little bit more complicated. Can I play things wherever? Right? There are some decks where it doesn't really matter where you play your cards. As long as you're playing the cards down, you're good to go. That makes it a lot easier to play because you don't have to worry too much about the particular location. You're just kind of focusing on, hey, I play the card in the right order. It makes sense. Do some cards have to be played before or after specific cards? So do you have to do like this into that, or like Psylocke into Sera, Shuri into whatever, Sera into flooding, right? Are there specific orderings that you have to do with a deck? Because that's going to make it harder, a little bit more complicated to play. Do you have to respond to what your opponent's doing? Honestly, every deck should respond to what your opponent's doing, but not every deck does. A lot of decks just play their thing and hope that their thing is better than their opponent's thing. They're not really reacting to what their opponent's doing. So if you are, those decks are usually more thought-provoking, more complicated to play, because you always have to balance what could my opponent play and then how do I counter it. Do you have to balance priority? Does your deck care if you have priority or not? That can be pretty important into understanding how the deck plays. That is something that can make it more complicated. And then does the archetype generally require extra tips or tricks? So is it something you have to kind of teach an opponent or teach a player how to pilot correctly? Does it require like, oh, you have to make sure that you're balancing this and this, or you got to make sure you move the card here so that you get the buff on the next turn? You can't move it early. Like those type of card decks, they just get more complicated than normal. So those are like my general criteria. And obviously, it's like 30 plus decks. I'm not going to get everything right, but I do have a general idea of how I'm gonna go. So let's get started. So here we have the list of the archetypes and just my guide. Simple, easy part 2. I think that one has the most slots, so I have 2 slots there. They're the same essentially. Intermediate, advanced, and like just complicated decks. So honestly, some complicated decks might seem really simple for you, but I just want to have like a differentiator between the tiers. Like I think this is like slightly more complicated than the other decks along the tier. So simple decks easy to pilot or very straightforward. Easy decks are like generally normal, I would say, and then it just gets harder from there. So let's get started with this list. First things off, we have Shuri. I do think Shuri is not the most complicated deck list. You do have the requirement of having to go Shuri into Red Skull, into Taskmaster. So the complication is like their ordering has to be required. But honestly, once you get it, once you understand it, I would say it is a pretty easy deck to pilot. It's not the most complicated. Next up, we have Thanos deck. I think all the Thanos decks we're going to talk about today are pretty hard. just because you're adding 6 1-drops to your deck. That's going to give you a lot of more options. They're all flexible cards. You can move some of them. You can change locations. They really do change how much thinking you have to do in a single game of Marvel Snaps. They're all pretty complicated. I do, however, think Thanos Death is maybe one of the easier Thanos builds to run, mostly because you're really relying on Killmonger and Destroy cards to really remove all of that complication, and then you set up for that last turn, Death plus Bomb, whatever you're going to follow up with. So because you're destroying a lot of those 1-drops, you don't have to think about exactly where those are. So this is one of the more simplistic Thanos decks. However, I still think it's pretty advanced. It's not in the hardest tier, but it is right there in very hard decks just due to the nature of Thanos deck building. Now we have Doomwave. I don't think Doomwave is too hard. You play your early game, then you wave, and then you usually want to play 2 cards on the final turn. So it's not too complicated. Definitely an easy deck to pilot. So definitely we'll put this up in the easy pilot category. Sera Control, I think, is pretty difficult. It does require you to think about what your opponent's doing. It's definitely a counter what my opponent's playstyle is, which just makes it a little bit more harder, a little bit more complicated. Definitely going to put it next to the Thanos Death there. Next up, we have Storm Control. This is like a very beginner-friendly deck. You can really pilot it with a lot of the Series 2 cards that you start with. I don't think it's too hard to play. You play Storm, you play Jessica Jones, and then you usually have Vision or some kind of late-game bomb, maybe Dr. Doom if you have it. So not a hard deck. Definitely a pretty easy deck to pilot once you figure out the strategies. Next up, we have Dracula Dump. I would say this one is not that easy. There's a lot of moving pieces. You have to make sure that you set up your Dracula in the right lane that you want to win, and then you're flooding with those very cheap cost cards. Because you have so many cards to play, it's a little bit harder to control exactly where you want to play it. It is nice that you do have this one lane where you're guaranteed big power. That makes it a little bit easier than maybe the more complicated decks, but generally a lot of moving pieces. I would say it's a pretty intermediate deck, kind of not the most easy to pilot. Next up, we have Bounce. So Bounce is a pretty difficult deck, if I say so myself. I think you're playing so many cards, and then you're bouncing it back. You have to make sure you're bouncing correctly. You have to make sure the early game makes sense. You have to make sure that you're playing Angela into Bishop first before you play the other cards. You have to make sure that your lanes are in the right place. You have to make sure that the Beast is bouncing. You're bringing back the right cards, not the wrong cards, or the Falcon is bringing back the right cards. You have to balance your hand space, you know, and then you have to make sure that your final turn hits all the points, that you have the locations in the right lanes, the locations of the right number of power. I would say it's definitely one of the more complicated decks to play in the game. So this is a very easy, complicated, highest tier of difficulty, in my opinion, to pilot. Next up, we have MoonGirl Dino. This is also a pretty beginner-friendly deck. You can really pilot it. The nice thing about this, I thought this deck was a little bit more complicated, but as I thought about it, I think it is generally easy, because what you can do is play MoonGirl Double Devil Soar, and that's just 3 cards, and that can carry you. That can win you the game. You just play those 3 cards in the right order, and you can win. So because the ceiling or the floor is so safe, I would say it's a pretty easy deck to pilot. Obviously, you can make it more difficult. You can add more pieces that make it a little bit harder to play, but I would say generally the floor of this deck is pretty safe, pretty smooth to play. Next up, we have Discard. I would say Discard is maybe the first simple deck we have here, just mostly because you just play your cards, you discard, and then you play your Swarms, you play your Apocalypse, and that's about it, right? Discard usually doesn't really care what gets discarded. It's just like, yeah, I just discard some cards. I've played my Modork, and my Morbius, I'm good to go. So it's pretty, I'd say it's definitely one of the simpler decks to play. You just do the same thing. You just have to make sure that your locations are all being contested with good cards. But generally, I would say it's one of the simpler decks to play. You don't really have to worry too much about what you're doing as long as you're doing the correct things. Next up, we have Classic Lockjaw. This one is generally pretty easy as well. You have to make sure you play your Lockjaw, and then you have to play your follow-up units into a Lockjaw. And once you understand that, you get a big card, you're good to go. It's not too difficult in how you pilot. You make sure you got the Lockjaw into something, and then you just have synergies following with Thor or Jane Foster or so. So I would say this also fits the easy category. I don't think it's too difficult. I could see some people arguing that this is a complicated deck, but I think once you understand the Lockjaw mechanic, it's a lot easier to pilot. Galactus. Now, what are your thoughts? What do you think Galactus is? I know I can hear the comments already. But I would say that Galactus is a simple deck. Yes, I know. I think you wave into Galactus, and then you play Spider-Man or whatever, and the game's over. You won with 3 cards. Like, it's not that hard. You do have to be careful not to play into a full lane or a lane with units with the Galactus. But once you understand that, I think this is a pretty simple deck. So I'm going to put it in the simple category. What are your thoughts on that one? Next up, we have Thanos Lockjaw. Once again, it's a Thanos deck. It's definitely going to be a little bit harder to play because you have all those moving pieces. But once again, it has the same kind of function of Lockjaw. If you can play a Lockjaw and then play the stones in the Lockjaw, get a good card, it becomes a little bit simpler to play. I would say it's a Thanos deck, so it's going to be hard, but it's not the hardest level of Thanos decks. It's still pretty advanced, obviously, but it's definitely a little bit of the easier variants of Thanos to play. Now here we have Hidmonkey. So Hidmonkey, I would say, is also a pretty difficult deck. It's a variation of the bounce archetype, so it's gonna have a lot of those bounce difficulties. It is differently piloted, of course, but you still are thinking about a lot of the strategies and tips that you're learning from the bounce meta to really incorporate into Hidmonkey. So I'd say this is also a complicated deck in there. You have to be balancing space very correctly. You have to make sure, you basically have to know exactly what's being played in all your lanes very early into the game. Like turn 3, you have to, okay, I'm playing this here, this here, this here, so that I have all the locations required to do my combo in the final turn. You have to know that, and it still requires the Bishop Angela setup if you're doing that variation. So definitely a complicated deck there. Nimrod Galactus, I do think is harder to pilot than straight Galactus. It's still a Galactus deck at its core, so you still have that wave Galactus win condition, but because you're adding the secondary Nimrod win condition, now you're thinking, okay, how am I going to play this out into the final turns? Am I going to go the Galactus variant, or am I going to go the Nimrod variant? Because of that, it's a little bit more complicated than straight up Galactus, but it's still pretty easy once you figure out what to do, and you have that floor of just playing regular Galactus that is still there, so it can't be too complicated, but it's in the easy category for me. Next up, we have She-Hulk Infinaut. So this one, I would say, is pretty complicated because you do have to set up with your pieces. It's one that requires tips and tricks. You have to know what you're doing with She-Hulk Infinaut. If you gave a new player this deck and told them to pilot it, they'd have no idea how to play this. They have no idea. So it does require that bit of extra knowledge, extra learnings, and then piloting it correctly also takes some skill to make sure that you have everything set up. But once you do that, it's pretty good. So I wouldn't put it in the most complicated category, but I'll definitely put it in advanced. You do have to know some things to understand and pilot this correctly. Now, Deathwave, I would say, is very similar to Doomwave. It's just as easy, in my opinion. I would say it's maybe easier than Doomwave because you destroy a lot of cards, so that simplifies your game plan, and then you just flood at the end, but it's still, it could be next to Doomwave. They're very similar deck lists, so we'll put it in the easy category. Silver Surfer. I think this one is not as easy as some of the other ones, but it's also not the most complicated deck list. You're playing your 2-on-2, then your 3, your 4. You want to play Sera on 5, and then you flood on the last turn. The difficulty just is how difficult it is to pilot and making sure that you are contesting every lane easily, or having the counter plays to mess with your opponents, whether that be Storm or whatever, Killmonger, whatever you're using. So I would say it's definitely an intermediate deck, not the most complicated, but still requires a lot of thought process and balancing of the locations to make sure you're doing it right. Next up, we have Kazoo. So this one, once again, is very similar to Dracula, where you're playing a ton of 1-drops, usually at the end of the game, and you have a lot of moving pieces to figure out exactly how much power you want in all those lanes. Can be difficult to really get that perfectly correct. So definitely an intermediate deck as well in terms of the difficulty to pilot. Now, Control is definitely one of the hardest archetypes to really play well. You have to always be thinking about what your opponent is going to do. And especially if you're not using like a Daredevil variant, if you're maybe playing Jeff instead of Daredevil or something like that, then you have to add that guesswork of, oh, are they going to play this here? And usually you're having some type of counter tools, whether it's Cosmo, Enchantress, Killmonger, Shang-Chi, etc. You usually have multiple counter tools in that singular deck that you're using to make sure that you're messing with your opponent. So this is definitely like a mind read type of deck where you have to be very aware of what your opponent can do and how you want to counter that in the best way. So I would say it's one of the more complicated decks to pilot. Now, Jink Viper is also pretty complicated in the sense that you have to be guessing where your opponent wants to play and messing them up. If you're using those hoods, those vipers, those green goblins, you're trying to lock their lanes up, right? So you have to be fully aware, trying to put yourself in the mind of your opponent, trying to see, oh, what are they going to do and how am I going to mess them up? So you're almost always thinking about your opponent. It's kind of like Control. You don't have those counter tools, but you have those annoying tools with Titania, with Green Goblin, with Debris to really just annoy your opponent and try to mess with them. It definitely requires a lot of effort to play these decks to a good level, and I would definitely say they're in the complicated tier. Wong Reveal, I would say, is not the most complicated deck list in my opinion. You're playing Wong, and then you're playing on reveals in the same lane, and as long as they go off, you win, right? It's not the nuttiest kind of deck to pilot. So I would definitely put that in the easy tier. As long as you are paying attention, it shouldn't be a pretty hard deck to pilot. So definitely you'll move that down there. Hela Casino, once again, I think this is a pretty simple deck. You're playing your discards. I think discard has a lot of benefit to being simple because you're not even playing half the cards. Half the cards you use are discarded, and then you just play a couple cards, discard them, and then play the hell at the end. Woohoo, you win, or woohoo, you lose. I wouldn't say it's a hard deck. Definitely in the simple category here, as long as you do everything correct. Now, here we have another Thanos deck, Thanos Control. I think these Thanos decks are going to be very complicated. There's so many moving pieces. You have to be thinking about your opponent. It's a control deck with Thanos in it. Like, it's going to be omega complicated. This one's a pretty simple placement here. Destroy decks, I would say, are not too hard to play. You do have to be careful of armor and Cosmo and those type of cards. But if you have the setup, you play the Bucky and then you play the Destroy in the same lane, so you don't have to think about, oh, what lane am I playing a lot of these cards. They usually have to be played in similar lanes, and then you set up for the Destroy late game, and then you could play Death or whatever you're going to do, Null, whatever combo you have for the end game. So definitely a pretty easy deck list in my opinion to pilot correctly. Next up, we have move decks. I think move decks are not that easy to play. They do require you knowing where you want your cards to be at the end of the game very early on. You have to play the card, have it move, and then go the other way. The saving grace of move is, since move kind of moves everything, it's very easy to contest the same lane, even playing cards in different locations. So you have that benefit of the concentration of your cards are pretty telegraphed, but overall, it's still not an easy deck to play. I'm going to put it a little bit above in the intermediate category. Now, Agatha, come on. Agatha is straight up here. It plays the deck for you. There's no way this is gonna be a hard deck to pilot a lot of the time. You don't have to do anything. If there was a tier above Simple, it'd probably be up there. It's like plays itself tier. This one literally just plays itself. So yeah, definitely a pretty easy deck to pilot. Next up we have Destroyer. I think Destroyer isn't too hard. You definitely have to be careful about making sure that your ongoings are in the same lane so that your armor can protect it from the Destroyer, or the Professor X will protect it from the Destroyer. So you're really just stacking one lane and then having Destroyer win a second lane, usually with some synergy, whether it's Cosmo or Colossus or something like that. But you're pretty much stacking just 2 lanes most of the time, so it's not too hard to pilot once you understand the play patterns. Next up, we have Mr. Negative. So I don't think Mr. Negative is the easiest deck to run, because you have to know your win conditions and you have to make sure you take advantage of those. So even though Mr. Negative wins are pretty easy to come by, you have to set up for those wins. You have to know the tips, right? You have to be aware that you have to Psylocke or Zabu early into the negative. Make sure you save your cards, flood in the last turn, take advantage of all those synergies. So it's not the easiest deck to run, but it isn't super complicated, because if you can go Psylocke into negative, draw Iron Man, like, okay, you're done. Like, the game's over. So it isn't the easiest, but I'll definitely put in the intermediate category in terms of difficulty to play and pilot. Now, Jeff Stature is kind of a new deck on the block. It's utilizing Jeff and Stature and Miles Morales and some of that to kind of have this very powerful late game flood, where instead of flooding with Sera or something, you're flooding with Statures and Miles Morales and all these like smaller cards that are harder to counter. So definitely a strong deck. I would say it's a deck that requires a lot of knowledge of the game. You have to be knowing all the mechanics, and you have to also just be aware how you want to pilot these and play your cards early on. So I wouldn't say it's the easiest to pilot, but it's not too complicated. I think once you play the deck a couple of times, you understand, oh, this has to go here. I have to move Jeff on this turn. I have to take advantage of this card here. Polaris has to be played here. There's a lot of little things to learn, but I think once you get there, it's not the hardest deck to pilot afterwards. So definitely will be in the intermediate category. Next up, we have Toxic Sera. Sera decks are kind of like Thanos decks in that they're a little bit complicated to play, because you're doing a lot of things at the final turns that require a lot of foresight into what your opponent's going to do at the last turn, and also where you want to be playing. So that makes it a little bit more advanced than, I would say, traditional other decks. And Toxic Sera is definitely one of the more complicated ones, making sure you have to have the Luke Cage and all that synergies there required. So definitely going to put it in the advanced category. Not too hard to play, but definitely going to take some learnings to really use it at the max effort. And then next we have Cerebro 2, Cerebro 3. They're kind of the same. In my opinion, they're not too different, but they're the most common Cerebro types. But in terms of Cerebro 2, Cerebro 3, I would say they're both pretty advanced in terms of you do have to know what you're doing with a Cerebro deck. If you give anyone a Cerebro deck and tell them to play it, they're not really going to know. You have to understand your goal is to have the same power on all your cards at the same time, and make sure that you're avoiding locations and cards and opponents that really mess with that. So it does require a better knowledge of the game than a maybe normal simplistic deck, but they are pretty hard to pilot. But they're not the hardest thing, right? They're just playing your cards down and making sure that you set up for a good Cerebro turn. And then Thanos Zoo, Thanos Ongoing, those also are kind of very samey in terms of the difficulty level. This one, you don't have the Lockjaw for Thanos. You don't have the Killmonger in the Death variants for the Thanos Death, you just have to rely on your 1-drops and your buffs and your ongoings. Definitely those are some of the more complicated decks you can run in the game. So definitely have to be aware of that and just making sure that you are taking it, being careful in how you pilot those Thanos decks. Darkhawk, I would say Darkhawk is not that bad of a deck. It's maybe a little bit harder than MoonGirl in that you have more moving pieces and it requires more setup. You have to know the rock slide interactions with the Darkhawk. You have to know when to play Darkhawk so it doesn't get destroyed by Shang-Chi or Enchantress or any of those cards. So it does require a little bit more knowledge of the game and a little bit more moving pieces than some of the easier decks, but it isn't too hard that you'll struggle. It's just a deck to learn, and then once you learn it, it's pretty good, pretty free-flowing. So I would say it's in the intermediate category. Not the easiest to play, but pretty safe once you get it locked down. Now, next up, we have Electro Ramp. I would say Electro Ramp is actually one of the more simple decks because you're limited to 1 card per turn. And really, a lot of times you're going Electro into a 5-drop, into a 6-drop, into a 6-drop. And that's really all you need to win. So you play 4 cards. A lot of the time, the lanes don't matter because you're playing Dr. Doom. And so you're just contesting everything. And you're just making sure it all works out. So I would say this is definitely up at the top in simple decks. Once you get the flow, it's pretty easy to run. A Patriot, I would say, is not the hardest deck to play. You do have to make sure that your ordering is correct. You do have to be balancing your locations, and like the Patriot goes here, the Mystique goes here, the Blue Marvel goes here. You have to balance that. But once you do, right, it's like Ultron, I win, and it's not too hard to do that correctly. So I would say it's definitely one of the easier decks to pilot. Definitely a deck I recommend for people if they want to climb, they don't really know what to do. Patriot's been solid for a long time, and I think it will continue to be solid in the game. And last up, we have Bastriot. So this is a Patriot version, but you're using Bast instead to kind of buff your smaller cards, and it just requires a little bit more moving pieces. You have more things to think about than Patriot. Patriot, really, Ultron is like your win condition most of the time, where it just floods everything. Bask, Patriot, Ultron is not really necessary. Obviously, you can use Ultron if you want to, but you don't need to at all, and you can win completely without utilizing a single big card, since your Bask will give you a lot of general power there. So definitely I would say it's a little bit more complicated than Patriot. It still has a Patriot base, but I would say it's a little bit more complicated than that general idea. So take a look at this. This is like the overview of the tiers. I'll see if I can make it a little bit bigger. Yeah, something like that. Oh, this is beautiful. So what do you guys think? You guys agree with some of these decisions? I thought this would be an interesting video just to kind of give people an idea of, oh, I just want to pick up something to play and hope it makes sense, hope it's very easy to learn. This is like my general guide for now of all the tier lists, how easy they are to pilot, and how it flows. So hope you guys enjoy this one. Hope you guys learned something. Let me know what you think about this type of video, and I'll see you in the next one.
Educated calling snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be improving. How you doing? You'll hit infinity and won't go back.